One of the most dramatic events in the history of Winchester, Virginia, and in fact of the whole Civil War in Virginia, is almost completely unknown. This is the story of Emancipation 1863 in Winchester, Virginia. Why is it so little known? Well, our typical look at the Civil War, the War of the Rebellion, looks at the military movements, the battlefields, the major military figures, and leaves out the ambitions, the ideals, the needs of the human beings who actually drove the war, made it happen, benefited from it, or lost from it. What happened here? Between January and May of 1863, thousands of African Americans left slavery, crossed the lines of the Army of the Rebellion, and connected with the U.S. Army contingent under the command of General Robert Milroy in Winchester. Under Milroy's command, and by the authority of the Emancipation Proclamation, those people were then legally free. Milroy then assisted hundreds, perhaps thousands, of these formerly enslaved people to go north to United States-controlled territory where they would be free. Who were they? We don't know their names. We don't know where they had lived, exactly where they went. They didn't have to cross any borders or show any passports. We do know that every step they took off the place that they were assigned to work, the place they were supposedly owned, put them at risk. We do know what they fled, a brutal system that depended every day on violence to keep them in place. And we know they risked that violence. And who was Milroy? Well, the first thing we know about him, the first and last thing, is he was a man of deep faith. This hymn, Am I a Soldier of the Cross, a follower of the Lamb, shall I fear to own his cause? Are there no foes for me to face? We don't know that Milroy sang this hymn, but it certainly fits his personality, and it's one we know was in popular use in Midwest churches around that time. Before Milroy came to Winchester, he had written to his wife that the United States was not winning the War of the Rebellion because Providence is not with us until the powers that be remove and abolish the great and mighty curse, the cause of the war, slavery. So when Lincoln finally chose to support that approach and signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1st, the same day that Milroy marched into Winchester, he was profoundly moved. He entered with a mission. First, he was restoring United States authority to the city of Winchester. And secondly, he was carrying out the Emancipation Proclamation. He and his forces controlled and administered the city until mid-May when the rebellion forces returned, heading up to Gettysburg. As a first step in Winchester, General Milroy wrote and posted his own proclamation, which stated basically that he would carry out Lincoln's proclamation and urged local residents and his troops to follow his lead or suffer the consequences. Milroy was quite aware that not all his troops considered they were fighting for emancipation. He also urged the newly freed people to be industrious and law-abiding. This is his proclamation. This was put all over the city of Winchester and the surrounding area. And to any enslaved people who could read, even that first sentence at the top, that first phrase at the top, must have been deeply moving. Somebody out there, for the first time in their lifetimes, somebody out there was taking their situation into account and acting on it. And it was apparently a person in power. But the leaders of the slavery business rebellion could read too. And they saw Milroy's proclamation as a threat of servile rebellion, that is, rebellion of enslaved people. And it also undermined their plans to use enslaved people to carry out their war. So they put a price on Milroy's head. This was January 10th. He'd only been in town 10 days, really hadn't done anything but put up his proclamation. Both houses of the General Assembly called for Milroy to be hanged, and they put a reward equivalent of $1.5 million today on his head. But Milroy and his troops went about what he believed was the Lord's business. They went out to nearby farms and homes, told enslaved people they were free, or enslaved people came to them and mentioned that their families and their possessions were back on the place where they'd worked, and Milroy sent out troops with them. Soon hundreds of people, we don't know the exact number, left where they were and came to Winchester. From Winchester, many of them then went north on U.S. Army wagons and trains. As historian Jonathan Nialis, the generally accepted expert on Milroy in this period, wrote, almost on a daily basis, hundreds of newly freed African Americans boarded wagons or empty supply trains and emigrated north. Milroy went up to see them and passed out pictures of John Brown. He'd been very moved when he came to Winchester to realize this was the place where the judge who had condemned John Brown had lived. So these people, some say as many as 5,000 formerly enslaved people, left the Shenandoah Valley for freedom in the north. As they departed, people could hear them singing songs of freedom and religious hymns peculiar to the race, as well as the more cheerful music of the fiddle and banjo. The Richmond Daily tried to put this in terms of something that the U.S. Army was doing to black people, impressing them into service. This Richmond daily paper went on to say that many have left their comfortable homes to test the hospitality of the North. It's hard not to read that sentence ironically. It wasn't Milroy's choice that people go north. He hoped to create a sanctuary in Winchester where he could protect these people for the rest of the war. But most of them knew how unlikely or uncertain that was. And sure enough, the rebellion forces did come back before too long. The interesting thing is that while there's no specific record of how all of this was done, where did the escaped enslaved people stay? What kind of work did they do? We know some of them did work for the U.S. Army, but we don't know what they did, who they were. There's no lists. But on the other hand, we know that there was no chaos, there were no riots, there was no starvation, there was no violence beyond what was already taking place due to the war. We know this because there's no record of it. The people who hated Milroy, the white former slave owners, had nothing negative to say about the presence of these African Americans. But they had plenty to say about Milroy. They didn't want to lose their free labor. They didn't want to lose their position of white dominance. Dr. Baldwin was told by the U.S. Army to pay his servant a small salary or be exiled from his home. He chose exile. Another Milroy hater, Mrs. Lee, called Milroy Hellroy. And another one said his reign was one of terror, that he was a rough, backwoods Western man. And she also thought his wife was ugly. I mean, these people really hated Milroy. One of those who was exiled from Winchester was Mary Tucker McGill. She was living with her mother. They ran a boarding house. They'd run a school. Now they had to run a boarding house in wartime. And they had to take in U.S. Army boarders. She kept arguing with them and condemning them until finally they sent her out of town. They simply felt that she was too dangerous to the U.S. Army. Unfortunately, she went on to be the author of the main school history, one that was used for 40 years in Virginia. It was an official textbook for schools. So she had a long memory. She spread it around, and it certainly helped to popularize the idea of Milroy as a truly horrible person. What did Milroy do to these civilians? He read their mail. He told them they couldn't buy food legally without swearing an oath to their country. He exiled a few of them, and he sent spies disguised as Confederate soldiers into local homes. The Richmond Daily Dispatch reported that gentlemen in the country are being arrested upon the slightest and most trivial pretexts, confined for 2 or 3 days in loathsome guardhouses, and then condescendingly permitted to return to their homes, but without their horses. Well, I can think of people who've been treated worse by regimes they didn't like. There wasn't any waterboarding. There weren't any fire squads to shoot civilians, even though there was a war going on. And of course, whites were not sold away from their families and forced to walk hundreds of miles in chains. This is a picture of an encounter that happened. One of the white ladies in town came to see Milroy. You had to see Milroy if you wanted to get something done. That's just the way it was. He was the mayor, the dictator, whatever you want to call him. He was running Winchester. And so she came to see him. And then these two black women showed up. And Milroy decided to see them first. Well, this was so horrifying to this woman who was a slave owner and fairly wealthy. The idea that black people could go before her, where there was even any question about where black people stood. As she left, she went home and she drew this cartoon, or as it's known, the Valentine, because she delivered it on Valentine's Day to Milroy, keeping another copy for a friend. And to her, all that was necessary was that she simply show what happened. That is, there were black women who were getting Milroy's attention, and she was not. That was enough. Who had a more urgent concern, who had been waiting longer, none of that would have mattered to her. Black people came second, if at all. And so she proceeded to unload her shock on the wealthy ladies of Winchester. Milroy also, he was a very strong believer. He believed that slavery was morally wrong. And when preachers came to him, he would preach at them. I certainly can't say that he was patient or kind or accommodating or tolerant. He was not that kind of guy. But on the other hand, he did have a point to make. In mid-May of 1863, rebellion troops were on the way to Gettysburg. Winchester was in the way. Milroy really had no choice but to leave, but because his orders were somewhat unclear and because he liked to fight, and so he wanted to stay and fight, he waited too long, and a number of his men were captured. He was almost captured. And all of this happened north of Winchester, but well before he got to Harper's Ferry, where he was headed. And this is really the only moment where apparently anybody on the rebellion side came close to getting the reward that had been sitting there on Milroy's head for 6 months, almost 6 months. Now, Milroy had led some bold fights in West Virginia and Western Virginia. He had attacked Stonewall Jackson once. As I say, he liked to fight, and he was very glad to fight in this cause. But he did get driven out of Winchester. And the work that he'd done in Winchester for the enslaved people didn't really matter one way or another to his superiors. As far as they were concerned, that was an army activity. So he faced some rough questions afterwards, and really was never in a command position for the rest of the war. He did go on, though, to have a federal career out in Washington State after the war, pretty much till his death. So how is he remembered in Winchester in 2017? Well, I'd never run into anybody who remembered anything about him except for supporters of the rebellion. And I really got slapped in the face with this when I walked into the official Winchester Frederick County Visitor Center and asked a question about Milroy and got the response from a volunteer, but still a representative of the public and of the government. Oh, we don't like him. Well, some people obviously did. Milroy was a man of deep faith. He believed that the enslaved were fellow children of God, and he believed that working for their benefit, for their freedom, was the most important thing he could do and his country could do. And of course, the people who came out of slavery were also people of faith. And though the rebellion forces claimed they were also Christians, it's a little hard to accept that idea. So he's not remembered in Winchester except as this bad guy, this ogre to white people. There's no statue, no monument, no memorial, anything like that. The statue shown here is in Indiana, where he lived during the war and after the war for a while, before going out to Washington State. But more important than whether Milroy is remembered, there's no memorial, there's no memory, there's not even a list of those people who risked their lives, came through the rebellion lines, left behind the people who had claimed to be their masters, and came to Winchester and gambled on a new life in a strange land. We don't even know their names, and yet these are the true heroes of freedom in Winchester's 1863 emancipation.